about technology, weapons of mass destruction, and terrorism, which I know is everybody's favorite topic right before Thanksgiving. But it's pretty important, and we'll make it as interesting as we can. When we're talking about technology, WMD, and terrorism, we need to start off by talking about something called asymmetrical warfare. A handful of you probably know what that is already, but if you don't, or even if you do, let's make sure we're all on the same page with it. When you think of warfare broadly in a macro sense, like warfare from 30,000 feet looking back across all of history, there is a useful perspective when thinking about war, which thinks about war in two ways. You say that there is something called symmetrical war, and there is something called asymmetrical war. Symmetrical and asymmetrical, they're different. So a symmetrical war is like World War II, or the American Civil War, or something like that, in which you have two uniformed military forces of roughly equivalent technological capability who are fighting it out. That's symmetrical war. Armies, tank divisions, airplanes, they have roughly equivalent capabilities. So for example, if the United States in the modern world were to fight, hopefully we never have to do this, but if we were to have to fight with China or Russia, that is generally going to be symmetrical. We're both of about equivalent technology and capability and things. It's not a totally mismatched thing. Asymmetrical war means that one side has vastly greater technology and vastly higher technological capabilities as a result. So the current wars the United States has been fighting in your lifetimes have all been asymmetrical by and large. There may have been some elements which were symmetrical very briefly. I'm thinking of the Iraq invasion in 2003, in which the Iraqi army did put up resistance for several weeks. Those may have been symmetrical engagements, but the war, by and large, that you've seen in your lifetime is asymmetrical. The United States has overwhelming technological superiority. We have air power, we have JDAM smart bombs, we have helicopters and satellites and M1 Abrams tanks and all these other things. And most of the people that we've been fighting with do not, bless you. Most of the people we're fighting with fight war like this, out of the back of the ubiquitous Technical, right? Toyota pickup truck in this case. The Toyotas are impossible to destroy. That's why they're used so heavily in the third world. You look at that and you say, well, what is that? I mean, well, it's a truck full of a bunch of Afghan fighters. It's a militia, an Afghanistan militia group. But you look at it and say, what is that technologically? That is their version of a personnel carrier. I mean, we use this multi-million-dollar thing called the Bradley with a turret and tow missiles and all this reactive armor and things on it to transport infantrymen around the battlefield. This is what they're doing that with. So thus, asymmetrical war. There's not technological equivalence. Now the one thing I really want to drive down this slide, beyond just the difference between symmetrical and asymmetrical, I want you to get this distinction. I want you to think about this for a few minutes. Americans have a tendency, because we are very technologically savvy, we're very tech-heavy people, our culture is based around technology in many ways. We look at technology and we say, because we have more technology than these folks, or a guy like that, because we have a different way of fighting war and things that's very technologically reliant, we are better. And sure, technology does give us an edge for sure. I mean, no one will doubt that. No one who has been overseas or anything says, oh, I wish we didn't have A-10s and JDAMs. Nobody, right? That really gives us an edge. However, and this is the important caveat, greater technology does not equal victory in war. It does not, right? Despite the technological edge, which we have held definitively, decidedly, since 2001, have we won in Afghanistan? We've done pretty well. We've achieved a lot of objectives. But has the technology won the war for us? Well, no, not yet. Hopefully we do win there. I'll suggest to you our victory there or not depends more on doctrine and the way we choose to fight the war rather than on some magical piece of technology that gives us the edge. Let me give you one more example real quick, a war that's already over. Vietnam, the Vietnam War. The United States had jet aircraft, artillery, armor, better trained soldiers, helicopters, the best and greatest technology of the day. We were fighting the North Vietnamese, who, by and large, their type of technology was the AK-47 and the RPG-7. And we won every single battle in Vietnam. We did not lose a single battle in Vietnam, but we lost the war. We lost national will to continue to fight, and so we just left and went home, right? So having greater technology and saying, well, because we're a technologically heavy people, we're going to win. We have, not necessarily. Don't think of war that simply, that it's just about technology, and whoever has the highest speed jet fighter wins the war. Not really. Mindset, mentality is much more important than technology, I'll argue, okay? But there's a difference, symmetrical and asymmetrical war. So when you think about war in that way, and that is the way that the Pentagon thinks about war, asymmetrical, symmetrical model, that's the way the military thinks about it. That's the way the military plans for wars and considers them. There are people within the military, I was one of them in my job in the Army, who specialize in asymmetrical war. I'm sort of an oddity in that sense. Like most people in the Army are very symmetrical in the way they think. They like to put pins on a map and move the 1st Infantry Division and 1st Cav, and you're moving them around on a map, and this is the front line. Other people like me don't look at it that way, much more asymmetrical. So what we're talking about today is asymmetrical war, and I'm going to tell you that the big concern throughout the military regarding asymmetrical war is not this. It's not these guys, and it's not these children in Afghanistan. That's not the concern in asymmetrical war in the current environment. It's this. It's weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction are kind of the ultimate tool in asymmetrical warfare. Because of current technology, a group of people that is fairly inextensively trained with less than perfect supply and less than perfect financial backing can get a hold of technology like this and employ it. A country like the United States, the most technologically advanced country in the world, is vulnerable to this, right? I mean, everybody knows it. Most people don't want to think about it or talk about it. But for almost 20 years now, going on almost 2 decades now, the big fear in the US military is that you're going to have some asymmetrical group, a terrorist organization, not a military, a terrorist organization gains access to this type of technology and employs it in some way. Now this is a pretty dramatic picture. You've got the mushroom cloud going off. It doesn't have to be that. You could have biological attack. That's a really bad one. We'll talk about that more Monday maybe. Chemical attack. All these sorts of things. A capability of destroying things en masse, weapons of mass destruction. So I do want to provide you with a brief definition of WMD because I'm probably going to ask a question about it, maybe multiple choice on the last test. WMD, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, and chemical. Weapons, nuclear weapons, boom, nuke. Biological weapons, things where you are spreading the plague, a weaponized form of it. Chemical weapons, things like sarin gas or VX gas or really awful things, kind of things that probably most of us wish had not been invented. So as we started this century, I mean this is early in most of your lives, most of you were probably like 1 or 2 years old when the events that I'm about to talk about took place. Makes me feel old. Terrorism and WMD. This has been the 2 big driving features about how the American government has interacted with a lot of other governments around the world. And what I'm especially referencing here is Saddam Hussein's Iraq. A lot of people, when they're thinking about this WMD and terrorism thing, they hunt for examples because fortunately this has not happened yet. But the fear is that it might. There's a possibility that it could. And so a lot of what the United States government does overseas and has done in recent years is an attempt to prevent this. So I'm going to be talking about Saddam Hussein's Iraq as a case study for you, for how this sort of technology and terrorism and WMD thing works together. And then at the end of the lecture, we're going to talk about a group called ISIS briefly, which all of you've heard of, I'm sure. Saddam Hussein, he comes to power in 1979 in Iraq. He is a Sunni Arab, which means he dislikes Shiites. It's another religious group within the Islamic tradition. He also dislikes a group of people called the Kurds, who live in northern Iraq. Arabs and Kurds don't get along. So he's a Sunni Arab. He doesn't like Shiites, he doesn't like Kurds. He comes into power in 1979, and his first act as the dictator of Iraq is to launch an invasion of his neighbor, Iran. In 1980, he invades Iran, the Iran-Iraq War, and it's all about stealing Iranian oil. He's trying to get Iranian oil reserves for himself so he can make extra dollars on the oil market selling that. Well, the war itself doesn't go so well, and so Saddam Hussein begins to try to use technology, weapons of mass destruction, to gain an edge in this war that he started with his much larger neighbor. So in 1982, he is trying to build a nuclear program. He's trying to build a bomb because he's way outnumbered. Iran is much larger as a country than Iraq. There's a lot more Iranians than Iraqis. And 3 years into this conflict, about 2.5 years into the conflict, Saddam has recognized he's bitten off more than he can chew. And so at a place called Osirak, which is just to the northwest of Baghdad, at a place called Osirak, he starts building a nuclear reactor. He's trying to develop fissile material with which he can build nuclear weapons and smash the Iranians into oblivion, win the war. He's made several pronouncements as he's building this reactor. He said openly that he's going to use it to strike Iran, and after striking Iran, he says, and then I'm going to burn Israel to the ground. And this is a threat the Israelis are going to take seriously. I mean, the Israelis are a people who, as recently as 1945, and in multiple wars since then, have experienced some pretty real efforts to eradicate them as a people. So when somebody like Saddam Hussein says, I'm going to get a nuclear weapon, and you're number 2 on the list, Israel, as soon as I deal with Iran, I'm dealing with you, Israel takes it seriously. So the Israelis launch an airstrike against his nuclear facility at Osirak, and they bomb it into oblivion. Airstrike, overnight, unannounced, the Israeli Air Force flattens Osirak and leaves Saddam Hussein with no nuclear program. So he doesn't have the nuke that he wanted, but he's going to turn to purchasing chemical weapons instead. He's able to buy this illicitly from the Russians and from the Chinese primarily. Now in 1988, he is well on his way to not winning the war. The war is ultimately going to be a draw. And Saddam Hussein's popularity is really low with his people. There's a lot of people in Iraq who are like, you put us into this terrible war, Saddam, and we've lost a lot of people, and we haven't gained anything. It's a draw. All this has been for nothing. And so Saddam is looking for a scapegoat within his own people. He's looking for somebody else he can blame for the fact that his war did not go well. And so in 1988, he says, it's the Kurds, the Kurdish people. It's K-U-R-D-S, the Kurds. They're an ethnic minority in Iraq. He hates them. He's an Arab. He doesn't like Kurds. He says, these Kurds in Iraq, they are disloyal. It's their fault we weren't able to defeat Iran handily. So he launches a campaign against them. It's a genocidal campaign called the Al-Anfal. It's A-L-A-N-F-A-L, the Al-Anfal campaign. 1988, a village, Halabja. It's in northeastern Iraq, near the border with Iran. This village is a Kurdish village. And the reason Halabja stands out as a place in an event of 1988 is that there are news cameras nearby. And Saddam Hussein's Air Force, they fly their jets over the village and they drop chemical weapons on these Kurdish civilians. This is genocide. It's mass murder of civilians at the orders of Saddam Hussein using WMD to do it. It's chemical weapons, it's WMD. So this is an important moment. I'm just going to step out of lecture mode for a moment and just tell you this openly, right? There's a lot of Americans who will say, well, Saddam Hussein never had WMD. 1988 he did. He used it on his own people. So as the war comes to a conclusion, this Iran-Iraq war, it's actually the third most destructive war of the entire 20th century. Only the 2 world wars are bigger in terms of loss of life. This war has been a disaster for Saddam. He gained no territory, he gained no oil, he's deeply in debt. His debts are coming due. So as the war concludes, 1988, 1989, the war debt's coming up. Didn't gain anything from it, but the bill's still due. So Saddam can't pay it. So he turns to his Arab neighbors. He turns to Kuwait, he turns to Saudi Arabia. He says, hey, Sunni Arab brothers, how about you help me pay my war debt? I fought against Shiite Persia, Iran, on behalf of the Sunni Arab world. Help me pay down my war debt. That's a lie. He didn't fight for the Sunni Arab world against the Shiite Persian threat. He was fighting to try to steal oil for himself, and it didn't go well. But now he's trying to spin it, he's trying to sell it differently so he can get some help paying the war debt. Saudi Arabia laughs at him. Nope, forget it, Saddam, we're not paying your war debt for you. Kuwait, they tell him no, but they tell him no much more politely. And the reason is that in 1989, Saddam Hussein has the 5th largest army in the world, and he lives right next door to Kuwait. And they don't want to say no too harshly to the guy. But he's looking for a cause for war, a casus belli as we would call it, with Kuwait. And in 1988, he says the Kuwaitis are doing something called slant drilling. They are drilling their oil rigs under the border, and they're sucking out Iraqi oil. They're stealing Iraq's oil for sale on the market. That's false. How do we know it's false? The Kuwaitis would have to be insane to do this. This guy has the 5th largest army in the world. They already know that he wants an excuse to go to war with them and invade them. Does anybody really think they're going to steal Iraqi oil and provide him with that? No. They have plenty of their own oil. He's hunting for a reason to go to war with Kuwait. So in 1990, he has a meeting. It's on TV, it's on YouTube now. He calls for a meeting with the American ambassador, April Glaspie. Now, April's a career State Department diplomat. She's very talented at Middle Eastern affairs. She's nobody's fool. She's a world-class traveler. She knows the region. She's a very bright woman. I've met her multiple times. Really smart lady. April Glaspie, Department diplomat, U.S. ambassador to Iraq. So Saddam calls for a meeting with her. She goes to the meeting because this is what you do if you're a diplomat. Diplomats frequently meet with foreign heads of state. That's their job. And so at this meeting, she's there thinking it's just a regular meeting, and it starts off that way. He says, how do you find Iraq? Are you enjoying your stay? Is it, blah, blah, blah. And then maybe 10 minutes into the meeting, he suddenly pops her the question. He says, what would the United States do if I invaded Kuwait, but I continue to sell you oil at current market prices? In other words, if I just keep selling oil, would you care if I take Kuwait? And she's caught wrong-footed. She isn't sure what to say, so she does what politicians and diplomats always do when they're not sure what to say, and that is to say something without actually answering. And so she gives him this very diplomatic answer, and as soon as the meeting ends, she goes back to the U.S. Embassy and she cables Washington. And she says, hey, Saddam Hussein's just asked me what we would do if he invaded Kuwait. I put the answer off to another time, but I need to know, what's our position? She leaves the meeting thinking she's put the issue off for another day. He leaves the same meeting thinking that she gave him the wink, wink, nudge, nudge, green light, go ahead. So he does. He invades Kuwait. He invades Kuwait. The fighting's over in 2 days. The Kuwaiti army does not have a chance. They're a tiny army up against the 5th largest army in the world. So he invades Kuwait. He conquers it. It's done. It's over with. The issue is, though, the United States does very much care about Kuwait. More than Kuwait, the United States cares about Saudi Arabia. Because the fear in 1990 is not just that Saddam Hussein grabs Kuwait and the oil rigs there, but what's to stop him from just going on and grabbing Saudi Arabia as well while he's at it? Now, had he done that, had he invaded Saudi Arabia after stealing Kuwait, he would have had control over 82% of the world's petroleum production. That is something the United States is not going to tolerate. A guy like Saddam Hussein with that level of chokehold control. So the American response is decisive and very, very rapid. Operation Desert Shield is a massive military buildup of American and coalition forces. Desert Shield is the plan to defend Saudi Arabia, to shield Saudi Arabia from a potential Iraqi invasion. Now, during these months, August of 1990 to January of 91, U.S. President George H.W. Bush, Bush the Elder, Bush Senior, whatever you call him, he goes on TV like once a week telling Saddam Hussein, you've got to get out of Kuwait. We're not going to permit you to remain, you're going to leave. Saddam doesn't leave. So in January of 1991, Operation Desert Shield becomes Operation Desert Storm, in which the United States military acts directly to throw Saddam's military out of Kuwait, make him leave. Two elements to the war. There's an air campaign in which you have technologies like this that we've covered in previous lectures, F-117 stealth bomber, using those GBU-24 laser-guided munitions we talked about last time, smart weapons. Americans are in love with technology, right? I remember as a kid, I was a kid at the time, my dad was deployed for this. I remember on the news, I would sneak out in the middle of the night and watch CNN, because you could see this incredible footage. Wow, look at what we can do. In a world of all this high technology, though, you still got to go in on the ground. There's still a ground war in the Persian Gulf War. It's 100 hours long. It's just over 4 days. The United States military drives Saddam out of Kuwait, and the Iraqi army goes from being the 5th largest in the world to not even in the top 50 within 4 days. Pretty decisive win. This U.S. soldier, 1991, First Persian Gulf War, you see what he's wearing. He's in the desert in Kuwait. He's wearing what we call mop gear, really hot Tyvek suit. He's in the desert. Why is he doing that? Well, because everybody knew that Saddam Hussein had WMD. He used it on the Kurds just a year or two previously. And so the fear was he's going to use it against U.S. troops in this First Persian Gulf War. What most Americans don't realize is Saddam Hussein had said he was going to do this. I'm going to use chemical weapons if you Americans come into Kuwait. And the reason that he didn't is that through back channels, the United States government made it known, we have this type of weapons as well. We have WMD also. We have a lot more than you do. And so your first use of this would spark an overwhelming response in like kind. Even the Saddam Husseins of the world can be stared down, in effect, is what I'm saying. So in the 1990s, we're going to cover a whole decade, like one slide here. In the 1990s, Saddam Hussein's Iraq was always in the news. Because in 1991, we didn't depose Saddam, we didn't remove him from power. For some pretty good reasons, actually, in 1991. The biggest reason being that in 1991, there's no plan for who you replace the guy with. You don't have like a plan for who's going to get put in afterwards, and you don't want to just destabilize a country and leave it hanging for obvious reasons. So as a consequence, we leave him in power, but throughout the 1990s, Saddam Hussein does not become repentant. He does not say, oh, I've behaved badly and I've done some awful things and I've learned my lesson. Instead, he says publicly, as soon as you Americans go home, I'm going to invade Kuwait again and then go after Saudi Arabia. So for the entire decade, from 1991 until 2003, 12 years, the United States military, at enormous expense to you, the taxpayer, maintained a force of 100,000 plus men and women on the ground in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia to serve as a defensive berm against Saddam making good on that promise. Problem didn't go away. Saddam was still a problem. And that's a really important point for where we're going. So every few months throughout the 1990s, he would come on TV, Saddam would, and he would make statements. I've got WMD. You know I do, because I've used it in the past. I'll use it again. And it was a statement that was made so repeatedly and by Saddam himself that the new presidential administration, the Clinton administration, which came into office in '92, had to take it seriously. And so the way the Clinton administration tried to deal with this WMD threat was by sending UN weapons inspections teams to Iraq to try to force compliance. The way this worked was sort of this cat and mouse game, where the UN weapons inspectors teams would show up at a site. They would approach the site and they would say, we're here to inspect the facility. armed Iraqi guards would stand them off. No, you're not coming in. There'd be all these cell phone calls being made. A few hours later, there would be covered trucks that drive away from the facility. And then the Iraqi guard would say, come on in, feel free to look around. What was in the trucks? Who knows? Many covered trucks leaving these facilities don't know what's in them. Still to this day, not quite sure what's in most of those trucks. Right? But probably your best guess as a reasonable person is that looks pretty suspicious given Saddam Hussein's past, given what's going on. So in the 1990s, as that progressed, the Clinton administration was fighting a low-grade war with Iraq. It was sort of an undeclared war, but in 1998, the Clinton administration said that Iraq was a no-fly zone. The Iraqi government was not allowed to fly aircraft over their own country. If we saw them up there, we'd shoot them down. We've carried out Operation Desert Fox. It was a 3-week-long bombing campaign, dropping bombs on downtown Baghdad and various other Iraqi cities to try to force Saddam Hussein to comply with this whole weapons inspections thing. He refused to do it. The importance of this slide primarily is to illustrate to anyone that the issue between the United States and Iraq that resulted in the 2003 invasion was not something that came about with George W. Bush in 2003. This is kind of a long-term thing. It's a long-term story with a lot of context behind it. So in the 1990s, while you have this WMD thing playing out with Saddam, you have a concurrent increase in terrorist attacks against the United States and against our allies. Most Americans have forgotten this. They've forgotten about this event. 1993, the World Trade Center in New York City was attacked by terrorists, not flying airplanes, but by a terrorist group that took a van filled with high explosives and parked them in the underground parking garage under Tower 1. And they detonated it, and it blew a huge hole in the underground parking garage, and it blew all the windows out of the World Trade Center. It hurt a lot of people, didn't kill tremendous numbers, but there were a lot of casualties. Now in 1993, the World Trade Center didn't get brought down. That didn't take place till 8 years later. This is sort of an early precursor event, though. The Khobar Towers bombings. Unless you were in the military or you know people who were, you probably never heard of it. But in June of 1996, a dump truck full of Semtex, which is a plastic explosive, pulled up outside the Khobar Towers apartment block near Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. The Khobar Towers was an apartment complex housing a lot of off-duty U.S. Air Force personnel and quite a few Saudi nationals who lived in the same complex. That dump truck was detonated, blew the face off the building, killed some U.S. military personnel and quite a few Saudis who just happened to live in that apartment complex. 1998, the embassy attacks in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. These American embassies had received warning that there's probably a high chance of terrorist activity, and so the Marine embassy guards had hardened those embassies fairly effectively. There were some casualties inside, but most casualties in the embassy attacks took place on the streets outside, where Kenyans and Tanzanians walking by on the pavement on their way to work got hit by the explosion. Quite a few of them killed and injured. The attack on the USS Cole, a lot of Americans still remember this. October of 2000, USS Cole was an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer who was on patrol off the coast of Yemen. A speedboat packed with high explosives zoomed out from the coast, slammed into the side of the Cole, put a hole in the ship, and killed 17 U.S. Navy sailors. Some images of this stuff. There's the parking deck of the World Trade Center in 1993. The van was parked in the sublevel. I mean, pretty extensive damage, some casualties from the event. That's the Khobar Towers building in Saudi Arabia, and this is outside the American Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya. That's USS Cole after it was hit by the explosive speedboat. Refloated and brought back to the States, been repaired. Currently, it's on patrol off the coast of North Korea. So you all know the person who's behind all of those attacks I've just mentioned. You all know him. I mean, I don't even need to talk much about him. He's the founder of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in Arabic just means the base. The base. bin Laden founded Al-Qaeda in the early 1990s. And when he did so, he set up a terrorist organization that was unique for its time. It was unique because of its organization. Terrorists tend to not be very well organized usually. Usually they're pretty violent, but not as well organized as they could be. He was kind of different. A few things about bin Laden. He was the son of the sixth wealthiest man in the world. His dad was the sixth wealthiest man in the world. I mention that because a lot of people, especially in the American media, they don't really understand much about terrorism. They just talk a lot about it on TV. And they'll say things that are ridiculous like, well, what causes terrorism is poverty. If we could just do away with poverty, we'd end terrorism. We wouldn't. This guy had more money available to him than all of us in this room put together in our entire lifetimes probably will. He chose to go become a terrorist and live in a cave in Afghanistan. Why am I mentioning it? Because you can't bribe the guy. It's not about money for him. It's not about, oh, if he had a better life as a kid, he could. No, it's not what it's about. So he founds this group, Al-Qaeda, and he does it by using what we would call a cell-based approach, which means that the individual groups within Al-Qaeda don't really have much contact with each other. And so what we could say about bin Laden and these various terrorist attacks that we just listed, he's not the one who's planning them, really. I mean, a lot of Americans think, oh, he's planning it, he's this mastermind. No. He's a facilitator. He's a financier. He provides the money and the facilities to train people who come to Afghanistan. They go to Terrorism 101 school on the bin Laden scholarship. They learn how to blow up buildings and do all this other unpleasant stuff. And then they're graduated back into the world. And they're told, go do your thing. So that's his role and his connection to it. It's worth knowing those sorts of details because a lot of Americans will say, okay, if you just take this guy out, you do away with Al-Qaeda. No, of course not. Yeah, you've taken the guy off the top, awesome. He's a terrible dude, world's better off without him. But it hasn't ended Al-Qaeda, obviously. So the reason for these attacks we've just mentioned, he makes videos in the 1990s, and he says the reason for these attacks is that the Americans are occupying Saudi Arabia, my homeland, my home country. It's religiously offensive to me for that to have occurred. Now, the United States is not occupying Saudi Arabia to offend people's religious sensibilities, far from it. The reason we're in Saudi Arabia in the 1990s is to keep Saddam Hussein from trying to grab the oil. But again, perspectives, they differ. People don't always see the world the same way. So bin Laden has set up this cell-based group, Al-Qaeda, in Afghanistan. He set it up in Afghanistan because the one thing he was really needing in the 1990s is a safe haven. He fought in Afghanistan during that Soviet invasion. We talked about that earlier in the course. And he knew a lot of people in the group known as the Taliban. And so as the Taliban comes to power in Afghanistan, he's buddies with a lot of them. He says, listen, I got a huge checkbook. Daddy's money goes a long way. I can make some donations to the Taliban. You know me, I know you, we're cool together. Give me safe haven where I can train these guys in the back hills of Afghanistan. The Taliban's more than happy to go along with it. The really frustrating part of this lecture is this slide, for me at least. Frustrating because throughout the 1990s, for 4 years, this is Osama bin Laden's house. That is his bedroom. This is where he got his mail for 4 years. They knew where he was at in the 1990s. Why didn't SEAL Team 6 go by and pick him up? Why didn't anybody go by and pick him up? It's in Khartoum in the Sudan. Well, the reason is that prior to 9/11, the U.S. government looks at this guy and they say, he's kind of this nut job. He's some fringe guy with a beard that lives in a cave. You don't take him seriously. Just making these videos where he's talking about the U.S. military occupying something. Who's going to believe this guy? It's not even really a threat. So they ignore it. They miss it. By the late 1990s, the CIA in particular was starting to really look at bin Laden because they were saying maybe he's not such a fringe guy after all. Maybe he's somebody you should take seriously. He leaves Khartoum in 1996 and he disappears. Nobody knows where he goes for about 2 years until he pops up again in Afghanistan. The CIA tracks him down in 1998. He's in Afghanistan. By 2000, they have a CIA unit, it's part of the Special Activities Division, it's on place in the ground in Afghanistan. They know where he is. They request authorization to finish him, knock him off in Afghanistan. They're denied permission. This is all public record now. It's kind of classified. They're denied permission to take out Osama bin Laden in 2000. And the reason is that lawyers at the U.S. State Department were unsure what the diplomatic fallout would be if you assassinate a Saudi national inside Afghanistan, especially when that Saudi national is the son of the sixth wealthiest man in the world. So they do nothing. They miss the chance. This is the result, right? 9/11. Most of you were like one or two. A few of us were not. Massive casualties, right? This is more Americans die in 9/11 than like Pearl Harbor. This is a pretty big event. So the United States goes into Afghanistan hunting bin Laden. We're going to be there for 10 years, trying to track down bin Laden and bring him to justice. But despite the fact that we get bin Laden in 2011, we're still there to this day because of the fact if you let Afghanistan become a country under the control of the Taliban again, you're going to end up with another bin Laden figure, just a guy with a different name, same kind of person. So stabilization operations in Afghanistan. And this is where the lecture gets really interesting for me at least. Post 9/11, the towers have just come down, the Pentagon's just been hit. Everybody in the US government is thinking how terrible this was, and it was terrible. But I want to give you some perspective, okay? 9/11 was caused by 19 guys with box cutters. That's how they took the planes, not some high technology thing. It was 19 guys with box cutters took the airplanes, caused all that death, destruction, everything else. So within the US government, post 9/11, here's the fear. What would have happened if instead of box cutters, those 19 guys had access to WMD? Wow. Instead of just bringing down buildings and killing several thousand people, they could have killed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions if they had sufficient amounts of WMD. WMD is a game changer. And so in the post 9/11 world, the biggest concern of the United States government involving terrorism is this WMD connection. And the guy who was tasked with preventing that was then director of the CIA, George Tenet. That's him. I don't know George personally. I've never met him personally, but I am very good friends. I have a lot of friends that are agency folks. I'm very good friends with the woman who was his personal secretary in the years 1999 to 2004. She went to all his big meetings. She lives in Anderson, actually. Really great lady. Sometimes I have her come talk to my classes when I teach classes on intelligence and things. George Tenet, head of the CIA. The thing I know about George Tenet, via my friend from Anderson, is that he was a technophile. He loved technology. He was so comfortable with technology. He was all about gaining intelligence through technology. He was a guy who was all about what the CIA would call technical sources. What does that mean for civilian folks? Technical sources? It means spy satellites. It means supercomputers and listening into people's cell phone calls. That's a technical source. It's using technology to gain information. What he wasn't so good at, because he wasn't as comfortable with it, is something we would call human or human intelligence. That's actual people on the ground that most people would say spies, agents. He didn't like that because that was dealing with this sort of unknown quantity of people. He was much more comfortable with the spy satellite, supercomputer, hacking people's email accounts, things like that. And so there was kind of this mismatch capability within the CIA just after 9/11. This mismatch because on the one hand, we're really, really good at this technical information thing, but our human intelligence capability was diminished. It wasn't where it should have been. And when you're in a place like Afghanistan, the really important one of these two is this. It's human intelligence. Because if you have the most high-speed spy satellite in the world and you can hack into anybody's email account, so what? You're fighting people in a cave who are writing little notes on a sheet of paper and handing it to an 8-year-old boy. And he's carrying it to the next cave over. You don't have the ability to intercept as much information as you want. So in a post-9/11 world, trying to prevent the spread of WMD, the CIA director, George Tenet, gave a directive This is right after 9/11. And he said, listen, if any CIA officer, agent, gets a whisper, the slightest hint of somebody trying to obtain WMD, we want to know about it. We're going to do something called stovepiping the intelligence, which means you take all that raw intelligence that comes in all the time, and anything that says WMD attached to it, it gets stovepiped. It just gets sent straight to the top. We're not going to take a lot of time to analyze it. Is it true? Is it not true? If it's true, how much of it is true? Right? Because the world of intelligence, I mean, people talk about intelligence and how intelligence gets things wrong all the time. They do. But they are working in a very murky world. They're working in a world where everybody is lying. The question is, bless you, the question is how much are they lying? And what do you know about what they're lying, why they're lying about it? It's very confusing, very murky. People have rightly said that the world of intelligence is like working in a wilderness of mirrors. You're not sure exactly what's reality sometimes. And so in a post 9/11 world, George Tenet's like, we can't afford to wait to see if information is true about WMD. I want that information right to the top so we can take action on it. Why is all this important? Well, because in a post 9/11 world, you've got this guy who has had WMD, he's used it against his own people, he says he still has it, and he's planning on using it again. Within the last few months, you've had the towers come down, you've had the Pentagon attacked, and people are saying, if this guy ever took his WMD and handed it over in whole or in part to a group like Al-Qaeda or some other terrorist group, you've got a disaster of unimaginable proportions. And so in 2002, this has now been declassified. It was a highly classified briefing slide. I'm so glad they declassified it so I can show it. This is a place called Ala Maria. It's in Iraq. When this briefing was delivered, the individual giving the briefing stood up in front of the room and was saying, what this shows you, this is a satellite image, satellite picture of a place, Ala Maria in Iraq. This is a WMD facility where Saddam, his WMD program was running out of, or had run out of in the 80s. What are you seeing here in 2002? All these trucks, those arrows are all pointing at trucks. And so the conclusions made off of this picture, all this increased truck activity means that this WMD facility is working like 3 shifts. They are producing this stuff as fast as it can go out the door. And all the trucks coming and going are evidence of that. Okay, so that was what was said at the briefing. Let's just think about it for a minute. What does that really mean, all these trucks coming and going? Well, the trucks are covered. It means there's a lot of trucks coming and going at this building. It could mean that there's WMD being produced round the clock here. Yes, it could mean that. That's a rational conclusion, given all the other evidence we talked about. It could also mean that you've got equipment being moved out of here to another location. This could all just be a giant bluff by Saddam. Let's play with the Americans a little bit. Let's just drive trucks around. Could be that. The point is, you don't know. We don't know. We still don't know. Because you need human intelligence on the ground, an agent, a person, who's in this program, who's providing you with intel, who's saying, yeah, these trucks, there's nothing in the back. Or these trucks, they're full of VX gas being moved. This is Ala Maria after the U.S. invasion in 2003. It's one of the big sites that the American military went to. When you look at this is like the back courtyard of the facility, and you look and you say, yeah, that looks kind of suspicious. It was. When chemical weapons experts folks, the bugs and gas guys, as they call them in the Army, went here, they took samples of the inside of these barrels, swabs, and they came back with a report. They said, yep, this place, these containers, these particular containers here, VX gas, really nasty agent, really nasty chemical weapon, VX gas, tons of it were stored in these barrels. And people say, well, how long ago? Not sure. Maybe the 1980s, maybe 3 weeks ago. It's not in the barrels now. It's been moved somewhere else or disposed of or something. But these empty barrels, it was there. There's evidence of it. So what? All this leads to this. In October of 2002, the George W. Bush administration requested that the CIA, the NSA, British intelligence, French intelligence, and off-the-record Israeli Mossad give their best estimate, their best guess, national intelligence estimate, their best guess. Does Saddam Hussein have a functioning WMD program, yes or no? I was not at this meeting, obviously. My friend Anderson was. She was there with George Tenet in the Oval Office. This meeting, according to her, went on for almost 18 hours. President George W. Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, George Tenet, head of the CIA. This meeting for 18 hours is about, does Saddam have WMD, yes or no? And at the end of the meeting, Vice President Dick Cheney asked George Tenet, he said, I've got to know, George, I need an answer. Do they have it, yes or no? And George Tenet's response, he said, it's a slam dunk, they've got it. All this evidence is trending towards the conclusion that Saddam Hussein has WMD. So here you go. October of 2002, this meeting, they say Saddam's got WMD, and it's at this meeting, as the meeting concludes, that the National Command Authority, the President of the United States, says we're going to task the military with invading Iraq and removing Saddam Hussein so that he doesn't ever have the chance to take the WMD he has and either use it himself or provide it to other people who would. So I think I've showed you this before, but I want to show it to you again. It's important enough to do, I think. WMD in Iraq, was it really there? Talk to people that have different opinions. But people, their opinions, and people are entitled to, but this is a fact. July 6, 2008, out of the LA Times. If you want that URL, it's there for you in the email. Go read the whole story yourself. You don't take my word for it. Montreal, Canada, the last major remnant of Saddam Hussein's nuclear program. It's a huge stockpile of concentrated natural uranium. It reached Montreal on Saturday, completing a secret U.S. operation that included an airlift from Baghdad and a voyage across 2 oceans. And occasionally people are like, well, he had a little bit, but it wasn't worth what we... 550 tons of yellow cake uranium. You do not use yellow cake uranium for anything except manufacturing nuclear weapons. If you've got that stuff, you have what we call intent, shall we say. Saddam Hussein, WMD. Now, how does all this translate into the modern world? Because most Americans are kind of beyond this whole Iraq war thing. 10 years ago, it was on everybody's conversation. Everybody's talking about this. Now, most Americans are kind of like, yeah, that was so long ago. This is why it's still important. It has to do with Iraq. It has to do with WMD. It has to do with terrorism. The Islamic State, or better known as ISIS, was founded by this man. His name is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which just means Abu Bakr from Baghdad. He was an insurgent during the U.S. occupation of Iraq, during the years we were there. He's a Sunni Arab who joined al-Qaeda to better be able to fight and kill Americans in Iraq. He was captured while doing so. He was a prisoner of war. He was captured and taken to a place called Camp Liberty, which is a facility located outside Baghdad. He was held there because he's a pretty bad dude. He's not the sort of person you want wandering the streets and kind of doing his thing. So he's a prisoner, and in 2011, you have a new administration in power in the United States. 2012 is a presidential election year, and various politicians very much wanted to be able to say, we're out of Iraq. So in 2011, against the advice of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the President made an executive decision. We're pulling the U.S. military out of Iraq in 2011. We're out. That's the exit strategy. So in 2011, the military has a choice about people like this. What do you do with him? You can't bring him to the United States and put him in a jail. I mean, if you brought some guy like this and put him in Greenville County Jail, you'd just be asking for al-Qaeda and ISIS fighters to show up trying to shoot him out and break him free, and nobody wants that in their county. So he's not coming to the States. In 2011, you can't send him to Guantanamo because that was supposed to get closed. We're going to shut that down. It was a horrible place. What do you do with him? So in 2011, no real good options on the table. The decision's made. We're going to secure from him a promise of good behavior and cut him loose. We did that. See ya, we're out of Iraq. Behave yourself. 3 weeks after he's released, he appears in public. He makes a speech in which he proclaims himself the new caliph. He founds what he calls the caliphate, which is a reference to history of the 600s AD, so like 1400-year-old history. He's saying, I'm refounding it, I'm the new caliph. Here's the flag of ISIS, the Islamic State. Really, really good at cyber terrorism, really, really good at this whole terrorism model of using technology to get their way. ISIS itself is a very flexible organization. They still control a fair amount of territory in northwestern Iraq. They've been driven back since 2016. There was a point in 2014, 2015, where a lot of people said ISIS is going to overrun Baghdad, and they're going to also take over Syria. They're going to control a lot of the Middle East. Now, since 2016, as the U.S. has begun to re-engage and support our allies in the region and things, ISIS has been constrained, constricted. But ISIS is interesting as a terror group because they love technology. And they especially have images like this. They're all about taking Google down. They repeatedly said, if we could just hack Google and the Americans couldn't use Google, it would bring American culture to a standstill. They've never heard of Firefox or something like that. I don't know. Yeah.
So what do ISIS directly control? Sorry.
What do they directly control? Well, right now, as I'm speaking, they control basically eastern Syria and the very northwestern corner of Iraq. They've been driven in somewhat. Now, none of you do this, ever. Do not ever do this. This image is from ISIS's webpage, and they have one. I've gotten this from friends of mine who work in the government still. If you were to go to ISIS's webpage, you're going to get flagged, and they're going to check out everything you ever say online after that. But this is part of their 5-year plan. They have a business plan, a business model, and this is what they say they want to do. They want to expand across North Africa. They have a 10-year plan, which sees them overrunning Europe, and they have a 20-year plan, which the globe, in that case, is all covered by ISIS. And they have this little Photoshop picture of the White House with the ISIS flag flying at the top of it. Now, is that ever going to happen? Probably not. I mean, these people are very fractious. They dislike each other even within their own organization. They're so unpleasant, shall we say, that Al-Qaeda has denounced them as being too extreme. If Al-Qaeda says you're too extreme, you've really got a problem. So why am I talking about ISIS and this technology thing at all? Because that should matter to you more probably than any of the rest of this. ISIS and you and technology, there's an issue here that you should be aware of. ISIS has excelled since they were created as an institution in 2011. ISIS has really